Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my fellow women respecters. I hope you're all having a good day. Today I'm gonna address an advanced video called Islam versus Women. And since this video pertains a lot to morals, ethics, and philosophy, I'm gonna address some of his arguments through philosophical refutations, through philosophical arguments of my own. And I actually wish to demonstrate today how Ridwan has a very bad and uneducated conception of questions of morality, questions of equality, inequality, etc. So let's get into it.
Some people in Western societies, such as America or Australia, might tell you that Islam is totally compatible with feminist ideas, or even that it is the most feminist religion. The truth, of course, is the opposite. We will be talking about the obvious. Islam hates and oppresses women. It does so in its fundamental scriptures, the Quran and the Hadith. It did so throughout its entire history, from Muhammad till the 21st century, and it is still doing so today. I chose this topic because this weekend, as many already know, is the Women's March 2018. From our experiences from last year, from the Women's March in 2017 after Trump became president, we can tell that this Women's March will also be a bit weird, that the hijab advocacy will be made, that people on the left will be aligning themselves with Islamists, with speakers for the hijab, with people who think hijab is totally freedom and not oppressive at all, and that Islam is actually totally nice, and that Christianity is even worse, and that the white people are even worse. That's why I chose this video.
Yeah, Islam is not a feminist religion. Islam's purpose was never to establish equality or equal rights between the sexes. My question to Ridwan is, why does he keep bringing up public speakers like Linda Sarsour, instead of Muslim women who are actual scholars that would completely disagree with her, but at the same time, never in their right mind would they agree with Ridwan, because they actually study the text and don't Google it like this young apostate memester. The fundamental scriptures of Islam speak of women highly, actually. The Prophet ﷺ even says that the best of us are those who are best to their women. The Prophet ﷺ praised the spirituality of women often, and women were historically given very important high positions in political, economic, and all other spheres. As for the hijab, it is simply an order for women. There is nothing oppressive or empowering about it. The hijab is meant to serve as a symbol of recognition and a protection for a woman's honor. We as Muslims, we believe in the divine command theory, the idea that those things which are deemed to be right and those things which are deemed to be wrong are right and wrong because God said or ordered that they are right and wrong. It's simple as that. And the way we prove this is by proving that God exists and that God has absolute and complete knowledge, which can be argued for through philosophical arguments and through historical proofs of the Quran's preservation, of the Quran's miraculous language, and etc., indirectly proving God and proving His messenger, which is our main source of morality. So essentially what I'm saying is, Ridwan, the burden of proof is upon you, not us. When you criticize Islam on moral grounds, you have to give us a standard by which we're going to measure morality. You can't just come and say X is false because I feel that X is false, or X is false because X harms people. That's using the harm principle, and although we are against harm, the Prophet ﷺ forbade harm, something that you think harms people might not be harming people. My question to Ridwan is actually, how do you prove that equality is moral in the first place? It is a burden of proof upon you, Ridwan, to show us why equality should be taken as a moral standard, because we as theists, not just Muslims, but as theists, can simply say that anything that is included in equality, or so-called what you call equality, if it opposes God's will, then it is immoral. And many people will agree with me, regardless if they're Muslim or not. So the main argumentation and the main debates should not be on these singular separate points. They should be on whether what we deem to be revealed by God is actually from God. Does God exist? And if He does He reveal this? If He does reveal this, then it follows that this is the moral grounding. So that is where the discussion should go. It shouldn't go in the direction of what about X point, what about Y point, what about Z point. It's a waste of time.
In order to understand how Islam treats women, we can look at history, but before we do that, we can look at Islamic scriptures. We can look at the Quran and we can look at what Hadith say. I will begin first with the Quran. One of the most controversial things in the Quran can be found in chapter 4 of the Quran, in verse 34. In verse 34 of the 4th chapter called Women, the Quran actually tells men, husbands, to beat their wives. It says, men are in charge of women by right of what Allah has given one over the other and what they spend for maintenance from their wealth. So righteous women are devotedly obedient, guarding in the husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed, and finally strike them. But if they obey you once more, seek no means against them. Indeed, Allah is ever exalted and grand. We see two things that are here totally incompatible with our feminist heroes in the West.
Please do refer to my previous video on the topic of women in Islam on this channel for the answer to this argument.
Another completely anti-feminist issue. Again in the 4th chapter, in verse 11, the Quran tells about inheritance, that girls or women deserve only half of the share that men or boys get from the inheritance, because women are only worth half as much as men.
Yeah, that's true. It's also true that there's cases in Sharia where women get more inheritance in comparison to their male equals. Just refer to this article by Yaqeen. And not only that, but a man must pay the dowry to a woman upon marriage, and there's no limit to the dowry. So in a nutshell, women end up having a much easier time when it comes to finance than men.
The Quran also advocates sex slavery. Again in the 4th chapter, this time in verse 24. The verse begins with the words, "And also prohibited to you are all married women, except those your right hands possess. This is the decree of Allah upon you." The Quran talks here about the people you can or can't have sex with. It clearly says here in the first part of this verse that you are not allowed to have sex with married women, but you are allowed to have sex with married women that your right hands possess, which refers to sex slaves, women that were captured in war and have husbands already. This verse is very clear, and it is also supported by a hadith, which tells the exact same thing, and it even tells the backstory of this whole thing. But I will come to that later in the part where we talk about hadith.
So I had a dispute with Ridwan on this topic on Twitter actually, and he seemed to have been very triggered due to being exposed on his unacademic usage of terms. I replied to Ridwan with an article done by brother Abu Amina Elias that demonstrates multiple fiqh opinions that prohibit forcing a person into sexual intercourse, regardless if they're a slave or not. In short, the article provides examples of how rapists were punished under Sharia by the Prophet ﷺ, the righteous caliphs, and the scholars. The most important part to note is that rape is by definition punished by either stoning or whipping, and the victim is not punished. Ibn Qudama rahimahullah writes in his Al-Mughni about a very important point. He rahimahullah says, and I quote, وَلَا حَدَّ عَلَى مُكْرَهَةٍ فِي قَوْلِ عَامَّةِ أَهْلِ الْعِلْمِ روي ذلك عن عمر والزهري وقتادة والثوري والشافعي وأصحاب الرأي ولا نعلم فيه مخالفا ولا فرق بين الإكراه بالإلجاء وهو أن يغلبها على نفسها وبين الإكراه بالتهديد بالقتل ونحوه. In translation, there is no legal punishment upon a rape victim according to the general opinion of the scholars. It has been narrated from Omar, Az-Zuhri, Qatada, Al-Thawri, and Al-Shafi'i, and the people of reasoning. We do not know of any disagreement. There is no difference between rape by force, which is that the person who rapes overpowers the victim, or rape by threat of death, and so on. So as you can see here, any type of coercion to sexual actions against a person's will was defined by our scholars as rape. Although the concept of consent didn't exist in that time, we can certainly see that the outcome of a person being forced into such environments is punished by Sharia law. Now, a sex slave by definition, according to academic papers and multiple dictionaries, is, first, a person who is forced to perform sexual acts and who is not free to leave the place where they are being kept or to stop the work that they are being forced to do. Second, a person, especially a woman or a girl, who is confined and is raped, sexually abused, or forced to work as a prostitute, also called a sexual slave. And third, a person who is forced into being available for sexual intercourse. As you can see, none of these three definitions fit the Islamic paradigm or view of slavery of women. The slavery of women in Islam does not permit any type of environments that these three definitions provide us. The best that Ridwan can attempt is with definition number 3 that says a person who is forced into being available for sexual intercourse. He could say that this means that a person being available for sex is enough to say that they are a sex slave, but then using that logic, one's wife would be a sex slave, one's partner, one's girlfriend or whatever, regardless if it's haram or halal now, speaking on a general note, they would be a sex slave because they're simply available for sex. So the key point here is forced. A person has to be forced into such an environment where they can be freely abused sexually in order for that to be called sexual slavery. So it is only rational to conclude that sexual slavery does not exist in Islam, since that which is defined as sexual slavery is strictly prohibited and punished as demonstrated in our earlier arguments in Islamic law or Sharia.
Another verse, the second chapter in the Quran, verse 228. The verse clearly tells us that men are a degree above women. And the addition by translators doesn't make it better. It says in responsibility and authority. Tell that to a feminist.
And I will. Feminists, we don't care what you think if your only argument for male and female equality is a liberal ideal based on democratic agreement. There's no such thing as an entity called equality in nature or in reality. In fact, the world is filled with inequalities, not just on the level of gender, but on the level of every individual human being. Not everyone is able to do everything. All people have their strengths and weaknesses. In reality, there's many inequalities between men and women. There are fields of knowledge, craft, sports, and etc. in which men are dominant. Likewise, there are equivalent areas of life in which women are the ones who are ahead. Professor Annetta Hurlitz's research is a good example of this. Professor Hurlitz conducted an analysis of over 617 studies that took place in 1973 to 2013, including more than 1.2 million participants overall, and concluded this. Generally, women perform better when it comes to remembering verbal information such as words, sentences, texts, and objects, but also the location of objects and movies. Men can better recall abstract images and remember their way back from one location to another.
That's all that I have to say about the Quran. Let's go to the next thing and let's talk about hadith, which is even worse. I want to begin with my favorite hadith about women. In this hadith, it says, "Isn't the witness of a woman equal to half of that of a man?" The women said yes. He, the Prophet, said, "This is because of the deficiency of a woman's mind." This is a Sahih Hadith by Muhammad. He said this, and this is directly related to the Quran verse 282 that we read a few minutes ago. Muhammad actually says that women are deficient in intelligence.
Refer to the same video that I mentioned earlier for the refutation of this argument.
I'm not arguing against this, I'm just saying... I'm just kidding. Another hadith tells us a little funny story in which Muhammad saw apparently an attractive woman or something outside, and then he decided to go to his wife Zainab and had sexual intercourse with her. So he was suddenly horny and went to his wife and had sex with her. He then went to his companions and told them, "The woman advances and retires in the shape of a devil. So when one of you sees a woman, he should come to his wife, for that will repel what he feels in his heart." It's a bit awkward. Yeah, it's awkward. So Muhammad sees a woman outside and feels this urge to have sex with his wife, goes home to his wife, has sex with her, and then goes out and tells to his companions that women come in the shape of a devil.
Refer to Farid's video called "The Prophet's Desire, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam marries adopted son's wife, debunked."
This one hadith is very important. The following hadith tells us that a wife always has to have sex with her husband if the husband wants to have sex. I will read it to you. Decide for yourselves. Allah's Messenger said, if a husband calls his wife to his bed, that is, to have sexual relation, and she refuses and causes him to sleep in anger, the angels will curse her till morning. Let that sink in for a second. Muhammad is the holy prophet of Islam and speaks to his people and says that his words are a guide for humankind forever. And he tells them that if a husband wants to have sex with his wives, the wives have to submit to that will. Otherwise, they will be cursed until the morning by angels. Dear feminists, if you want to be a Muslim woman and you have a husband, then you have to have sex with your husband whenever he desires to have sex with you. Marital rape is not a thing in Islam. It doesn't exist.
How does this approve of marital rape? It's simply saying that it's sinful to refuse a husband's call to the bed if that will anger him. It doesn't say that a woman cannot refuse. The key part is not angering the husband. Besides, the Prophet ﷺ told people not to get angry quite often. In fact, the hadith is a proof against marital rape itself. Because had it been the case that the Prophet ﷺ was as Ridwan describes him, it'd be expected that he'd say something on the lines of, he may force himself upon her, or something like that. However, no such thing is found in the hadith, and is a proof that refusal is allowed. Refusal, while angering one's husband, is sinful, but certainly isn't a permission for marital rape. Otherwise, it would have been explicitly explained. The term marital rape is a very modern term as well. So although it isn't found in the fiqh books officially as marital rape, the idea of a husband forcing himself upon his wife, or vice versa, is deemed forbidden and sinful according to most Islamic schools of fiqh, and classified as dar, or harm, which is a valid reason for divorce.
Another hadith that I like very much, Muhammad basically hears news from Persia that they have a female ruler now, and he makes a commentary on it and says that never will succeed such a nation as makes a woman their ruler. Well, it can be kind of confirmed today, but still, misogyny in Islam. In another clear hadith, it also says that Muhammad gave men permission to beat their wives. And afterwards, many women came to complain to Muhammad about how their husbands beat them. But Muhammad didn't say much about it, except that they are not the best of you.
Yep. And seriously though, who cares? As I said previously, my only problem with what Ridwan is saying are the ideas that Islam permits rape, marital rape, or oppression against women. Yes, there are limits for women. There are limits for men as well. Yes, Ridwan, men are superior to women in authority and responsibility. Heck, maybe even in general. But how exactly is that oppression? You're basically trying to argue like this. X deems that Z is superior to Y. Deeming that Z is superior to Y is morally wrong. Those are your two premises. And then the conclusion would be, therefore, X is morally wrong. Now, the burden of proof is upon you to prove that the second premise is true. Otherwise, if it turns out that deeming Z superior to Y is morally right, which can be argued for from divine command theory, then your conclusion is actually that which is fallacious. And my point here, honestly, is not to flex on women and say, oh look, I don't give two damns about equality. My point is that lacking a belief in absolute equality does not entail that one is oppressive towards women. A man can hold the idea that a woman is not able to be a general, and at the same time be the best gentleman in the world, with his behavior and courtesy towards women. Basically, all of Ridwan's arguments could be put into this horrible syllogism. Premise 1. Islam does not advocate for total equality between the sexes and permits hitting one's wife. Although note, he does not mention the conditions for this being permitted, he makes it seem as if wife beating is a common daily practice that a man can do whenever he feels like, which is demonstrably false by virtue of Islamic scholarship. Premise 2. A system that does not advocate for total equality between the sexes and permits hitting one's wife is oppressive towards women. Conclusion, therefore Islam is oppressive towards women. As for premise 1, we can simply say that lack of total equality between sexes is not an implication of oppression, as oppression by definition is the exercise of authority or power in a burdensome, cruel, or unjust manner. The Islamic view of limiting a woman's movement, for example, by 3 days of travel on her own, or the prohibition on her being a caliph, or discouragement from attending the military, is all done for the sake of uplifting burdens. These are examples of these inequalities. When it comes to travel, for example, it is done in order to protect her from harm, as it is seen that generally women have a more difficult time defending themselves in unknown environments. A proof of this would be the fact that 90% or more of rape, which occurs in such environments, is done by men. As for the prohibition of being a caliph, its benefits include women avoiding the responsibility of political turmoil while being pregnant or needing to take care of the children or going through menopause cycles. Generally, the Islamic goal for society, other than establishment of religion, is establishment of healthy families, and that would necessitate widespread marriage, so this should not be dismissed easily. As for attending the military, it is so because the Prophet ﷺ forbade the killing of women and children in war, so it is only logical that he would not want them to be exposed to danger, let alone dying. As you can see, all rulings of Islam, other than being justified by the fact that they are orders given by God, also have their maqasid, pre-intended purposes that are found there for just reasons and the purpose of uplifting burdens, that which is opposite to oppression. So the idea of total and absolute equality being a necessity for not oppressing women falls off, as it is not necessary for avoiding oppression. In regards to hitting one's wife, this, along with the divine command theory approach, is justified by simply saying that conditions are put upon the man before he is allowed to strike his wife lightly, as approved by the Prophet ﷺ, according to many hadiths and Ibn Kathir's tafsir and the similar. These conditions include the man first consulting his wife, and then after a period of time, if that does not solve the issue in the family, separation from bed is permitted, and if that seems to be futile, then the last resort is hitting one's wife lightly. All of these 3 steps are only permitted in the case of a woman showing arrogance, which in the Arabic is called nushuz, different from istikbar, which includes the following according to Ibn Kathir rahimahullah. Acting as if she is above her husband, disobeying him, ignoring him, disliking him, and so forth. And as you can see in the text which is displayed on the screen, there is a difference of opinion as to what the husband's right actually is. For example, one of these narrations only mentions that the husband's right is that he can have the right to prohibit anyone he wants from being a guest in his house. That's it. Now obviously this is not the only right that the husband has over his wife, and similarly wives have many rights over their husbands. But the point is that the purpose of these rights is so that people, both men and women, husbands and wives, avoid mental and physical abuse. So the permission for hitting one's wife is done for the sake of uplifting burdens, which is again opposite to oppression. This means that both of the key factors of Ridwan's premises fall apart, and therefore it follows that the conclusion is also false or not true. I would like to finish off this video with the following. I am probably going to be heavily criticized by feminist type Muslims and non-Muslims alike that believe in total equality between the sexes. But my argument is not about arguing against or for equality. It is simply about showing how equality is not an entity and not a standard of morality that is provable. To claim that a religion is immoral without putting forth a moral standard to judge it by other than one's feelings or the agreement of the majority, which is called argumentum ad populum, is an illogical proposition. As far as I'm concerned, I don't mind viewing Islam as a religion advocating types of equalities. I'm in fact 100% convinced that men and women are spiritually equal and that neither of us are limited from entering any type of level of paradise or, God forbid, hell. The only exception being the prophets, who happen to be all men, although the reason for them being prophets is not that they are men but rather God's will. Another thing that I mentioned throughout the video is that there is an emphasis on protection of women in Islam. Some might criticize this by saying that we are assuming women are weak. However, this is a false assumption. Nowhere do we argue women are weaker than men. We simply believe that women deserve to be honored and protected because God ordered us to do so. And from a non-philosophical perspective, I would like to ask my respectful opponents, isn't fighting for the safety and honor of women a noble thing anyways? For me, the honor of women is more important than equality. And that is what makes this moral judgment superior to feminism. I hope that makes it clear. Wassalamu alaikum. And stay away from Ridwan.